The night it happened, I remember the faint buzz of my phone pulling me away from the quiet hum of my thoughts. A simple message from a friend who had been at the same bar as my wife that evening. Saw Rachel tonight. Thought you should know. She was close with someone. I stared at the words for a moment, my mind feeling oddly detached. The message felt foreign, like a stone dropped into a still pond, creating ripples that didn't quite reach me. My first thought wasn't anger or betrayal. It wasn't even sadness. It was curiosity. I could picture Rachel clearly in my mind. Her olive green dress, the one that hugged her figure perfectly, her dark hair tied back in a way that revealed the sharp angles of her cheekbones. She had left the house that evening with a light in her eyes, the kind of energy that comes from anticipation. I hadn't asked her many questions. I never did. She was out with her friends, a group I didn't particularly care for but didn't begrudge her either. I stared at the message again. Close with someone. What did that even mean? I didn't respond to my friend. Instead, I set my phone down and leaned back in my chair, letting the weight of the moment settle around me. It wasn't that I didn't care. It was more that I didn't know what I was supposed to feel. Rachel came home late that night, the faint click of the door signaling her return. I was still awake, seated on the couch with a book I hadn't really been reading. She didn't notice me at first as she slipped off her heels, her movements unsteady. "Good night?" I asked, my voice cutting through the quiet. She started, her head snapping up to look at me. Her face was flushed, not just from the alcohol, though I could tell she'd had a few drinks. There was something else in her expression, a kind of hesitation, a flicker of guilt she couldn't quite mask. "It was fine," she said quickly. Too quickly. She avoided my gaze, busying herself with setting her shoes neatly by the door. I watched her for a moment, the way her fingers fumbled slightly as she adjusted her dress, the way she kept her back turned to me. I felt a strange calmness settle over me, like the eye of a storm. "I got a message tonight," I said evenly, closing the book and setting it on the coffee table. That froze her. Her shoulders tensed, and I saw her take a slow, measured breath before turning to face me. "About what?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "About you," I replied, "and some guy." Her lips parted slightly, her eyes widening for just a fraction of a second before she schooled her expression into something resembling composure. "James, it's not what you think." "I don't think anything," I interrupted, my tone calm but firm. "I'm just repeating what I heard." She hesitated, her hands clasping together in front of her. "We were just talking. That's all." I tilted my head slightly, studying her. She was a terrible liar. Always had been. I could see the cracks in her facade, the way her gaze darted away from mine, the way her voice wavered ever so slightly. "Rachel," I said softly, "if you're going to lie, at least make it believable." Her breath hitched, and for a moment I thought she might deny it again. But then she sighed, her shoulders slumping as she sank onto the edge of the couch across from me. "Okay," she admitted quietly. "I kissed him, but it didn't mean anything." There it was. The truth, laid bare between us like an open wound, and yet I felt nothing. No surge of anger, no wave of betrayal, just a strange, hollow sort of detachment. I leaned back, folding my arms across my chest as I regarded her. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because—" She hesitated, running a hand through her hair. "Because I knew you'd find out. And because I didn't want to lie to you." I couldn't help the bitter smile that tugged at my lips. "But you were going to, weren't you? If I hadn't said anything." She flinched at that, her gaze dropping to her lap. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "It was stupid. A mistake. It didn't mean anything, James. I swear." I stared at her for a long moment, her words echoing in the silence between us. I wanted to feel something, anger, disappointment, sadness. But all I felt was tired. "Why?" I asked finally, my voice quieter now. "Why did you do it?" She looked up at me then, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I don't know," she said, her voice cracking. "I was drunk and I don't know, James, I just—" She broke off, shaking her head. "It was stupid. I wasn't thinking." I nodded slowly, letting her words wash over me. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that it was just a meaningless mistake, a lapse in judgment. But there was a part of me that couldn't help but wonder if there was more to it than that. "Do you want me to leave?" she asked hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees as I stared at the floor. It started with a message. The faint glow of my phone illuminated the darkened room, the quiet buzz drawing me out of my thoughts. It was late, too late for casual texts. My thumb hovered over the screen, the notification glaring up at me like a challenge. "Hey, saw Rachel out tonight? Thought you should know. She was with some guy. Pretty close. Sorry to bring this up, but I felt you should hear it from me." The words sat there, heavy and unyielding. I read them again and again, waiting for a spark of something, rage, hurt, confusion, to ignite in my chest. But all I felt was a strange, hollow calm. Rachel, my wife. The woman I had spent the last 8 years of my life with, the one who knew me better than anyone else. The thought of her kissing someone else should have shattered me, should have sent me spiraling into a storm of emotions. But instead, I felt nothing. The sound of the clock ticking filled the silence, each second passing like a dull echo in my mind. I closed my eyes. The words on the screen burned into my thoughts. Hours later, the sound of the front door opening jolted me from my trance. Rachel stepped in, the faint click of her heels on the hardwood floor announcing her arrival. I watched her from the couch, the room dimly lit by the glow of a single lamp. She didn't notice me at first. Her movements were deliberate but unsteady, alcohol no doubt. She set her bag down, slipped off her shoes, and reached up to remove the earrings that dangled from her ears. "Long night?" I asked, my voice cutting through the stillness. She froze, her hand midway to her ear. Slowly, she turned to face me, her expression a mixture of surprise and unease. "Oh," she said, her voice faltering. "You're still up." I didn't respond, my gaze fixed on her. She looked beautiful, as always. Her dark hair framed her face in soft waves, her makeup still intact, despite the lateness of the hour. The emerald green dress she wore hugged her figure perfectly, a dress I remembered complimenting her on when she left earlier that evening. She shifted under my gaze, her hands clasping together nervously. "Yeah, it was a good night. Just drinks with the girls." Drinks with the girls. The words hung in the air between us, fragile and flimsy. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees. "Did you have fun?" She hesitated, her eyes darting away from mine. "Yeah, it was fine." I nodded slowly, the corners of my mouth twitching into a faint, humorless smile. "You sure about that?" Her breath hitched, the faintest crack in her composure. She looked at me then, really looked at me, as if searching for something in my expression. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, her voice sharper now, defensive. I reached for my phone, tapping the screen to bring up the message. Turning it toward her, I watched as her eyes scanned the text. The blood drained from her face, her lips parting slightly as she took a step back. "James, Don't," I said, my voice low but firm. "Don't insult me by lying." Her mouth opened and closed, as though she were searching for the Right words, but couldn't find them. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "Okay," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I kissed him." There it was, the truth, simple, unadorned, and devastating. I leaned back, letting her words sink in. "Why?" She flinched at the question, her hands twisting together nervously. "I don't know," she said, her voice cracking. "It just happened. I wasn't thinking." "Were you drunk?" "Yes, but that's not an excuse," she said quickly, her eyes pleading with me to understand. "I swear, James, it didn't mean anything. It was a stupid mistake." A mistake. That's what she called it. As if a single word could erase what she had done, could absolve her of the choice she had made. I stared at her, the silence stretching between us like a chasm. I wanted to yell, to demand answers, to make her feel the weight of what she had done. But all I could do was sit there, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions I couldn't untangle. "Do you love me?" I asked finally, my voice quieter now, almost afraid of the answer. Her eyes widened, tears spilling over as she rushed toward me, dropping to her knees in front of the couch. She grabbed my hands, her touch warm and desperate. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling. "Yes, James, I love you. I've always loved you. This was a mistake. A stupid, meaningless mistake. Please, you have to believe me." I looked down at her, at the woman who had been my partner, my confidant, my everything. And for the first time that night, I felt the faint stirrings of something in my chest. Not anger, not sadness, disappointment. The first spark of realization ignited in the dim light of that restaurant. Her reaction, so quick to deflect, so hurried to dismiss, told me everything I needed to know. She thought she could outmaneuver me with her feigned confidence and dismissive laughter. But what she didn't understand, not yet, was that I wasn't the man she could toy with anymore. I lay in bed that night, the faint glow of the streetlights filtering through the curtains. Rachel was curled up beside me, her breathing steady, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air. I turned my head slightly, watching her. She looked peaceful, her face softened by sleep, and for a brief, fleeting moment, I wondered if I was wrong. But then I remembered the message from Dee, the way her hands had trembled just slightly when I mentioned the bar, the way her voice had wavered as she tried to dismiss the story. No, I wasn't wrong. The next morning, I woke up before her. The house was silent, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window as the steam curled up from the mug in lazy spirals. This is where it starts, I thought. Right here, right now. No more doubts, no more waiting for her to tell me the truth. I opened my laptop and started making a list. It wasn't dramatic or impulsive, just a calm, methodical outline of what needed to be done. Confirm everything. Document evidence. Secure finances. Plan exit strategy. There was a strange sense of clarity as I typed, each keystroke solidifying my resolve. For too long, I'd allowed myself to be passive, to give her the benefit of the doubt even when my gut told me otherwise. Not anymore. Step 1 was simple. Confirm everything. That evening, I casually asked her about her weekend plans. She smiled and told me she had a girls' night coming up again, the same easy lie she'd told before. I nodded, pretending not to notice the way her gaze flickered away, the way her hands fidgeted with the edge of her sweater. As soon as she left, the house that Saturday night I followed. It was easier than I expected. She wasn't cautious or discreet, probably because she thought I was too trusting, too oblivious to even suspect her. I parked a safe distance away from the bar she'd mentioned and waited, my heart pounding with a mix of anticipation and dread. When she finally walked out, she wasn't alone. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and younger than I'd imagined. She laughed as she leaned into him, her hand resting on his arm. They walked down the street together, their bodies close, their conversation easy and intimate, and then, right there under the yellow glow of a street lamp, she kissed him. It wasn't anger that washed over me in that moment. It wasn't even sadness. It was something colder, something sharper, a sense of finality, of detachment. I raised my phone, the camera capturing every detail. The way she tilted her head, the way his hands rested on her waist, the way they lingered as though they had all the time in the world. Thank you, I thought. Thank you for making this so clear. I drove home that night with the window down, the cold air stinging my face. It felt almost cleansing, like I was shedding the last remnants of who I'd been before this moment. By the time Rachel came home, I was already in bed, feigning sleep. She slipped in beside me, her movements careful, her breathing shallow. I didn't stir. Let her think everything's fine, I told myself. Let her believe she's still in control. Because when the time came, when the pieces were all in place, I wanted her to feel the full weight of what she'd done. That night, as Rachel slipped back into bed, I lay motionless, feigning sleep but feeling everything. The mattress dipped slightly under her weight, and the faint smell of wine and perfume lingered in the air. She was careful, too careful, though she feared waking me. I heard her exhale softly, a sound so fragile that it could have been mistaken for relief. My eyes remained shut, but my mind raced. This was the moment I thought would break me, I mused, but instead, it feels like the beginning of something far more powerful. Morning arrived, and I went through the motions of our usual routine. Coffee brewing, light chatter about the day ahead, her laughter as she scrolled through her phone. I mirrored her, matching her tone, her movements. It was a game now, one she didn't know she was playing, and I was going to win. I started with the simplest steps. It was almost poetic, really, how her carelessness had become my greatest advantage. She left her phone unlocked on the kitchen counter while she showered, a mistake she wouldn't have made if she believed I was paying attention. I skimmed through her messages, my fingers steady despite the storm brewing inside me. There it was, messages to D. The kind of playful, flirtatious exchanges we used to share back when I thought we were unbreakable. Plans for dinners, shared inside jokes, even photos. I took screenshots of everything, sending them to my email with a calm efficiency that surprised me. Evidence was power, and I was quietly building my arsenal. Her emails came next. Bank transfers to a joint account I didn't recognize. Receipts for dinners at places she'd claimed to have visited with friends. Even hotel bookings, short stays. On weekends, I'd been away for work. The weight of her betrayal pressed down on me, but it didn't consume me. Instead, it sharpened my focus. Let her believe she's still untouchable. Let her think I'm the fool. Step 2. Finances. I called my attorney, someone I trusted implicitly, and explained the situation in detail. The tone in his voice shifted as I laid it all out, the calm before a storm he'd clearly seen many times before. Document everything, he advised. Keep your movements quiet. The more she believes you're in the dark, the better. I set up a separate account, diverting portions of my income into it under the guise of business expenses. I reviewed our shared accounts, noting every inconsistency, every purchase that aligned with her lies. The picture became clearer with each passing day. The hardest part was pretending. I sat across from her at dinner, nodding as she talked about her day, her laughter ringing hollow in my ears. She reached for my hand at one point, her fingers brushing against mine. I looked at her, forcing a smile that felt foreign on my face. "Are you okay?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. I hesitated, just for a moment before replying, "Yeah, just tired. Work's been crazy." She nodded, seemingly satisfied, but her eyes lingered on mine for a fraction too long. Does she suspect something? I wondered. But then her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen, her expression softening. In a way that wasn't meant for me. No, she's too distracted to see me coming. I began noticing the small things that gave her away. The way her phone was always face down on the table. How her laughter sounded forced when she told me about her girls' night out. Even the way her perfume lingered a little too long after she returned home. But I didn't let her see that I'd noticed. I didn't confront her, didn't lash out. Instead, I learned to wear my ignorance like armor, every bit of evidence another piece of steel added to my shield. The first crack came on a Wednesday night. She was in the shower, the faint sound of water running behind the closed door. Her phone, as always, was on the nightstand. This time, though, she'd forgotten to set it to silent. A message pinged. I didn't even have to unlock it. D. Can't stop thinking about last night. You looked incredible. I stared at the message for a long moment, my heartbeat steady, my hands unnervingly still. I read it again and again, each word carving itself into my mind like a chisel against stone. The initial sting of betrayal wasn't what I expected. It wasn't fire or fury. It was cold, calculated clarity. I placed the phone back exactly as I'd found it and left the room. By the time she emerged, wrapped in a towel, I was sitting on the couch, flipping through the channels. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice casual. "Yeah," I said, not looking up. "Just relaxing." She smiled, leaning down to kiss my cheek. Her wet hair brushed against my skin, and for a fleeting moment, I felt the warmth of her lips as if it still meant something. But it didn't. Not anymore. The weeks that followed became an exercise in patience. I downloaded an app to clone her phone, syncing every message, call, and photo to mine. It was easier than I thought it would be. She never changed. Her passwords never questioned why I was suddenly more interested in working late or catching up with friends. The hardest part wasn't gathering the evidence. It was the waiting for her to make a mistake big enough to justify what I was planning. And then it happened. Friday night, she said she was meeting her coworkers for drinks. Her outfit, AA, little black dress and heels, seemed excessive for the dive bar she claimed they frequented, but I didn't question her. Instead, I followed her. It wasn't hard. She didn't check her surroundings, didn't look over her shoulder. She drove straight to an upscale lounge across town, a place we'd never been together. I waited in the parking lot, my heart beating steadily, my hands gripping the steering wheel. A few minutes later, I saw him, a tall, broad-shouldered man with salt and pepper hair. He greeted her with a kiss that lingered far too long to be platonic. I pulled out my phone, capturing everything from the safety of my car. Every smile, every touch, every stolen kiss. They disappeared inside, and I sat there for a long time, the weight of the moment pressing down on me like a tidal wave. This is it, I thought. This is the moment I take back control. The next morning, the world outside seemed deceptively serene. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, painting lazy patterns on the hardwood floor. Birds chirped a melody, oblivious to the storm brewing within me. I sat at the dining table, sipping, my coffee, the manila folder resting like a loaded gun on the seat beside me. She shuffled into the room, still in her robe, her hair pulled into a messy bun. She looked almost innocent in that moment, like the woman I had married years ago. For a fleeting second, I hesitated. Could I be wrong? Could there be a misunderstanding? But then her phone vibrated on the counter, and I saw it. The brief flicker of panic in her eyes. She snatched it up too quickly, turning her back as she scrolled through the screen. My heart hardened. "Morning," I said, forcing a smile. My tone was as smooth as the coffee in my mug. "Morning," she replied, glancing over her shoulder with a small, distracted smile. "You're up early." "Couldn't sleep," I said. The lies slide so easily now, don't they? She didn't. Press further just poured herself a cup of coffee and busied herself at the sink. I watched her, studying every movement, every nuance. She was so good at this, too good. But then again, so was I. The first step was simple: distance, emotional and physical. I started working late, claiming deadlines and meetings that didn't exist. I'd leave the house earlier than usual, texting her at odd intervals to say I was busy. At first, she barely noticed, her attention too divided between me and him. But gradually, I saw the questions forming in her eyes. "You've been working a lot lately," she remarked one evening, her voice casual but tinged with something sharper. "Big project?" I replied, not looking up from my plate. "You know how it is." She nodded, but her gaze lingered on me a moment longer than usual. I met her eyes, unflinching. She blinked first, looking away. Good. The second step was subtle: sowing doubt. One evening, I casually mentioned a story about a friend whose wife had been caught cheating. Her head snapped up at the word, her fork hovering mid-air. "What happened?" she asked, trying to sound indifferent. "Oh, you know," I said, leaning back in my chair. "He found out, confronted her, and now they're getting divorced." "Ugly situation," her throat bobbed as she swallowed. "That's unfortunate." "Yeah," I said, letting the word hang in the air. I studied her reaction from the corner of my eye, the way her fingers tightened around her glass, the subtle tension in her jaw. She didn't ask anything further, but the seed had been planted. The third step was calculated: create a mirror on. A Friday night, I told her I was meeting an old friend for drinks. In reality, I sat in my car a few blocks from home, waiting. Sure enough, within an hour, her car pulled out of the driveway. I followed her at a safe distance, my heart pounding despite my meticulous planning. She met him at the same restaurant as before. I watched as they greeted each other, his hand resting a moment too long on her lower back. My grip on the steering wheel tightened, but I didn't move. This wasn't the time for confrontation. This was about control. The next morning, I left a receipt for a high-end bar, one I'd never been to, on the kitchen counter. When she saw it, her brow furrowed. "You went to the Orchid?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "Yeah," I said, sipping my coffee. "Client meeting?" "Why?" "No reason," she said, but her eyes betrayed her. She was trying to piece it together, trying to decide if there was more to my story. The air between us grew heavier with each passing day, thick with the tension of unsaid words and hidden truths. I could see her mind working, always calculating, always unsure. She'd started watching me more closely, her eyes lingering when I didn't expect it. And yet, there was an edge to her, something distant in her demeanor that told me she was beginning to understand. This wasn't just business as usual. Something had shifted, but she didn't ask. She couldn't, not yet. Not until I was ready to confront the mirror I had set in front of her. One evening, after another day of meticulous silence and calculated detachment, I returned home later than usual. I could hear the faint sound of the TV from the hallway, a show I didn't recognize. She must have been trying to fill the emptiness, distracting herself from whatever gnawing uncertainty had taken root. I paused at the door, hearing her mutter to herself under her breath. I pushed it open gently. She looked up as I entered, startled, her lips forming a tight smile. "You're home late," she said, glancing at the clock. There was something in her voice now, a tremor beneath her calm. It wasn't the casual statement it should have been. It was an observation, a question. "I know," I replied, removing my coat. "Long day. More of the same." She nodded, but her gaze never quite left me. It was as though she was measuring me, testing the waters of whatever I had become. I knew she was waiting for the right moment, the moment when she would finally ask. She just didn't know if she could bear the answer. Later that night, when the house was quiet and the light from the bedside lamp cast long shadows, she finally spoke. "Do you ever think about what happens if we don't work?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I looked over at her, pretending to be lost in thought. I knew exactly what she was asking. The walls were closing in. The tension was too thick to ignore any longer. "I think about a lot of things," I said softly. "But I'm here. You're here. That's what matters." It was a safe response, one that could have been read 100 different ways. I could have let the moment slip by, could have given her a reason to believe everything was fine. But there was no more room for pretense. I could feel the weight of her stare, the unspoken question lingering between us. She wasn't satisfied with my answer, and I knew it. The silence stretched out, both of us caught in the quiet uncertainty. My body was tense, my mind already racing ahead. How far do I push her before she breaks? The next day I knew things had changed. Her behavior was sharper, more calculating, as if she was testing the waters of my patience. She no longer hid her phone when I was near. She no longer fumbled to respond to my questions. It was all too clean, too rehearsed. She was preparing herself for the storm, I realized. But she didn't know I had already set it in motion. That afternoon, I arranged for everything to fall into place. The final piece of the puzzle was now in my hands, a dinner reservation at the same place where they had met, a time and date that would line up perfectly with her schedule. I could almost feel her tension in the air, the way she'd be torn between the guilt and the allure of continuing the affair. I placed the reservation confirmation on the kitchen counter, tucked neatly in front of her coffee cup. Her eyes would fall on it when she returned from work. There was no need to say a word. The invitation was already there. The evening came, and I was sitting at the table reading a book when she walked in. I could feel her eyes immediately drift to the note. I didn't say anything at first, watching her carefully, noticing the slight deepening of her breath. "I got a reservation for tonight," I said casually. "Thought you might want to go out." Her face faltered just a fraction. There was the briefest pause, a flash of panic that flickered behind her eyes before she recovered. I don't think I'm up for it tonight," she said quickly. I leaned back in my chair, my voice soft but measured. "You sure? It's your favorite place." She hesitated. For the first time in days, she looked genuinely unsettled. The mask was cracking, and I knew it wouldn't be long before she cracked too. "I don't think I can," she muttered, almost to herself. "Maybe some other time." I stood, walking toward her, the subtle power shift clear in my every step. I didn't need to say anything more. I could feel her heart racing, the tension rising in her chest. She couldn't lie anymore. She couldn't keep pretending that the threads hadn't already been cut. And I had the power now to unravel everything, piece by piece. The silence between us stretched thin, a fragile thread waiting to snap. She stood there, her back slightly arched as if she were trying to shield herself from the weight of what was unsaid, what was hanging just beneath the surface. She couldn't look at me directly. Her gaze flickering toward the floor, then toward the door, then to the reservation confirmation still lying on the counter. I could see the gears turning in her mind, the internal battle playing out behind her eyes. It was the first time in a long while that I saw her so uncertain, so exposed. She knows. The realization hit me with a quiet intensity. She knew exactly what I had done. She could feel the pull of my intentions, the way I had orchestrated this moment down to the smallest detail. The very thought that she might not be able to keep up the charade any longer, it shook her just for a moment. I let the tension simmer, giving her the time to stew in her own thoughts, to taste the bitter truth on her tongue. The ball was in her court now. All I had to do was wait for her to reach the precipice. I don't know what you want me to say," she muttered, her voice trembling. It was the first crack in her usual composure. She was unraveling piece by piece, the walls she had built so carefully starting to fall away. I could feel the faintest trace of satisfaction slip through my chest, but I did nothing to show it. I remained still calm, watching her carefully. "You don't have to say anything," I replied, my tone soft but heavy with the weight of what was coming. "Not yet, anyway." Her breath hitched, and she finally looked up at me, eyes wide, a thin line of fear forming between her brows. I knew then that she was afraid of what would happen next. The house we had built together, the life we had shared, was about to collapse. And she could feel it, the ground shaking beneath her feet. The safety she had relied on for so long was slipping away, and I was the one who had taken the first step toward tearing it all down. "I don't want to lose this," she said quietly, the words barely escaping her lips, almost as if she were talking to herself more than to me. Her voice was thin, fragile, a small, helpless plea. I stepped forward, closing the space between us, and the room seemed to grow smaller, tighter. This is the moment, I thought, feeling the pulse of my own heart in my chest, slow but steady. I could see the panic building in her, the recognition of her actions sinking deeper with every word. "Then why did you kiss him?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The question hung between us like a razor's edge. She flinched, her body stiffening, her eyes dropping once again to the floor. She couldn't meet my gaze, not yet, not with the weight of her own guilt pressing down on her. For a long moment, there was nothing but the sound of our breaths, tangled and uneven. And then, in a voice that cracked under the pressure, she spoke. "I don't know," she whispered, her shoulders sagging in defeat. I didn't mean for it to happen. It just did." The words were hollow, and I could hear the sharpness of her regret cutting through every syllable. She wanted me to believe that it wasn't planned, that it had been an accident, a momentary lapse. But I knew better. I had seen the way she looked at him, the way her fingers had lingered longer than necessary, the way her eyes had sparked when he smiled at her. But I let her speak, let her continue unraveling. The truth, her truth, was so much more painful to her than it could ever be to me. And that knowledge, that raw truth, was all I needed. "I'm sorry," she repeated, her voice low, pleading. "I never wanted to hurt you. It felt like something I needed at the time." I could feel the bitterness rising in my throat, but I swallowed it down. "What was it you needed?" I asked, each word measured, precise. "Was it him? Or was it something you thought you were missing?" She shook her head, her eyes still cast, downward. I don't know anymore." There it was, the first admission of doubt, the first crack in her armor. She was no longer sure of her own desires, her own decisions. The foundation that had held her together was crumbling, and now I could see it, the weariness, the emptiness in her expression. The betrayal wasn't just of me, it was of herself, too. I reached out, my hand brushing against hers, the lightest touch. She flinched, her body stiffening, but she didn't pull away. For a moment, I thought I could feel the weight of her guilt settling between us. A tangible thing, a force that both repelled and bound us together. "I don't know how to fix this," she whispered. "I don't know how to make it right." I met, her gaze then, my own expression unreadable. The flicker of regret in her eyes was enough. But the question remained. Was she truly sorry? Or was she simply afraid of what would happen when the truth came to light? The silence that lingered in the air between us was thick, oppressive, heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. She was standing there, still, not moving, not speaking. I watched her, noting the tremor in her fingers as they fidgeted. With the edge of her sleeve, the way her shoulders hunched ever so slightly. I could feel her guilt wrapping around her like a cloak, pressing down on her chest, squeezing the breath from her lungs. She's unraveling, I thought. The realization was sharp, almost sweet in its clarity. She hadn't expected it. She hadn't expected me to know, hadn't expected me to confront her so directly. And as the truth sank in, I could see it in her eyes. She didn't know how to handle this. She didn't know how to fix it. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, her gaze flicking up to meet mine for just a split second before dropping back down again, unable to hold my stare for more than a fleeting moment. There was something vulnerable about her now, something that hadn't been there before, something I hadn't seen in years. The carefully constructed walls, the charming facades she had built to hide her mistakes, were beginning to crumble before my eyes. She was exposed in a way I hadn't anticipated, and it made me question everything. What do I do with this? I took a step back, running my hand through my hair, the frustration simmering beneath the surface. It wasn't just about the kiss anymore. No, this was bigger than that. This was about the years of trust we had built together, the fragile foundation of our marriage, and the way it had been shattered by a single moment of recklessness. It was about all the times I had turned a blind eye to her distractions, to her distance, to the quiet absence that I had ignored for far too long. And now it had all come crashing down in one brutal, undeniable truth. I watched as she bit her lip, the faintest trace of tears threatening to spill over, but she didn't let them fall. She was too proud, too afraid of how vulnerable she had become in that moment. And I could see it, the weight of her regret, her uncertainty. But as much as I felt for her, as much as I wanted to hold her and tell her everything would be okay, something inside me held me back. I've been here before. I've seen this game before. The pattern was familiar. She was sorry, but was she truly sorry enough to change? Was this moment of confession going to be the catalyst for something different? Or was it just another false beginning? I couldn't decide. I wasn't sure I cared to anymore. "I never wanted to hurt you," she whispered, her voice strained with emotion. I didn't think it would go this far. I let her words hang in the air, not because they had any real meaning, but because I wanted her to feel the weight of her own actions. I wanted her to fully understand what had just happened, the damage that had been done. The betrayal wasn't just about her lips pressed against another man's. It was the lies, the secrets, the unspoken resentment that had built up between us over time. "You didn't think?" I asked, my voice soft, almost mocking in its bitterness. "How many times have you told me that? I didn't think, I didn't mean to. How long are we going to keep doing this, huh? How long until you realize that you've been hurting me for years, with your silence, with your distance?" Her eyes widened slightly at my words, and she took a step toward me, her hand lifting as if to reach out. But she stopped herself midway, unsure. She was afraid of what I might say, of how I might respond, and for the first time in a long while, I let the anger burn bright and hot inside me. "I've been patient with you for so long, but you've never really seen me, have you? You know what the worst part is?" I continued, my voice gaining strength, more confident in the rawness of my emotion. "The worst part is that I did see it coming. I saw the signs. But I thought I could trust you. I thought we had built something solid, something unbreakable." I stepped back, the cold air between us growing even colder, sharper. "But here we are, and now all I can think is, what am I supposed to do with you now?" She flinched as if struck by the weight of my words, her face pale, eyes wide and brimming with regret. She opened her mouth, but no words came out at first. Then, finally, she spoke. "I never meant for any of this," she whispered again, her voice cracking. "I thought I could make it right before you found out. I thought I could fix it before it became real." "Fix it?" The word echoed in my mind. How could she even think she could fix it now? There was no going back from here. I watched her carefully, studying her every movement, every flicker of emotion that passed over her face. And then I finally spoke again, my tone cold, calculated. You can't fix this. Not like that. Not with words. Not with empty promises. She recoiled, a fresh wave of guilt washing over her. The air was thick with tension, each breath an effort, each heartbeat a reminder of how much we had lost. I stood there, looking at him, unable to speak, unable to form the words that might somehow make things better. The truth was, there was no way to undo what I had done. No amount of apology or explanation could erase the betrayal, the kiss that had set everything in motion. I didn't mean for any of this, I thought, desperately trying to make sense of the chaos swirling around me. I never meant to hurt him. His words had struck me like a slap to the face, and though they were harsh, they were the truth. Every syllable, every accusation was deserved. I had made choices, careless choices, and now we were both paying for them. I could feel the weight of those decisions pressing down on me, crushing me under their sheer enormity, and yet I couldn't help but feel trapped. How had it come to this? How had I let myself slip so far away from everything I'd once cherished? From the life we'd built, the love we'd shared. I could see the anger in his eyes, the disappointment so raw it almost physically hurt to witness. His posture was rigid, his hands clenched at his sides, and I knew without a doubt that he was close to breaking, close to walking away, to finally giving up on me, on us. I had expected this confrontation, had known deep down that the moment would come when I would have to face the consequences of my actions. But now that it was here, I was paralyzed, caught between guilt and fear, unable to make the first move toward healing. He had always been the steady one, the rock, the one who held everything together. I had relied on that, perhaps too much. His patience, his forgiveness. Had I taken that for granted? Had I believed that his love for me could withstand anything, even this? I wanted to tell him how sorry I was, how deeply regretful I felt. I wanted to reach out and hold him, to make him see that I hadn't meant for things to spiral so far out of control. But the words stuck in my throat, lodged there by the weight of my own guilt. Instead, I took a tentative step forward, my hand shaking as I lifted it, unsure of whether he would allow me to come any closer. But before I could close the distance, he spoke again, his voice cold, calculated, as if he were trying to distance himself from the rawness of the emotions swirling. Between us, you think you can just apologize, and it'll make everything go back to normal? He asked, the bitterness in his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. You think you can fix this with a few words? His gaze was piercing, his eyes narrowed in disbelief. He was angry, more than angry. He was wounded, and I could see the raw vulnerability hidden just beneath the surface of that anger. He was hurt, and there was nothing I could do to make that better, no easy way to take back what had been done. I didn't think it would be like this, I realized, my heart heavy in my chest. I didn't think I'd lose him over a mistake, over one stupid decision that spiraled out of control. I never wanted this, I said quietly, my voice barely a whisper. I never wanted to hurt you. The words felt hollow even as I said them. I knew they weren't enough. They couldn't undo the damage. I could see the skepticism in his eyes, the disbelief that I was even standing here, talking to him like everything was normal. But how could it be normal after what had happened? He stared at me for a long moment, the tension between us palpable, before shaking his head slowly, as if he were in disbelief at what had become of us, of our marriage. I can't do this anymore, he said, his voice low but firm. I can't keep pretending that everything's okay when it's not. You've hurt me. in ways I don't even know how to process yet. And you're standing here, asking me to just forgive you, to move past it. I can't do that. A sharp pang of regret shot through me, but it was quickly overtaken by a surge of frustration. I had let this go on for too long, hadn't I? I had let things fester, let myself drift away, and now I was standing here, begging for a chance that I wasn't sure I deserved. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, I said, my voice trembling with the weight of the admission. But I'm asking for it anyway. I don't want to lose you. Not like this. Not because of my mistake. There was a long, agonizing silence between us, the tension thick enough to choke on. I could see the internal battle waging inside him, the struggle between what he knew was right, walking away, protecting himself, and the part of him that still loved me, that still wanted to believe in the woman I used to be. I could see it in his eyes, the hesitation, the uncertainty. But there was something else there, too. A quiet resignation. He was tired. Tired of the lies. Tired of the distance. Tired of feeling like he had to carry the weight of our relationship on his own shoulders. The silence that stretched between us was unbearable, thick with the weight of everything left unsaid. My chest tightened, each breath feeling like a struggle as his eyes, those once warm, loving eyes, now stared at me with a coldness that pierced deeper than any words could. It was a look I had feared but never truly expected to see. How had we gotten here? I could still hear the echoes of the night out in my mind. The laughter, the music, the alcohol that had clouded my judgment, the touch of someone else, so foreign and yet so familiar in its fleeting warmth. How had it all spiraled so quickly? And worse, how had I let it happen again? It wasn't as if I hadn't known the consequences. It wasn't as if I hadn't anticipated the damage this would do to him, to us. But now, standing before him, the cold, hard reality hit me like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just the kiss, the act itself. It was the betrayal, the deception, the disregard for everything we had built together. The trust I had shattered in a single reckless moment. And now, here we were, teetering on the edge of something I couldn't undo. You didn't just kiss him, did you? His voice was quiet, controlled, but there was an underlying tremor to it that I couldn't ignore. The weight of those words, the accusation, the truth of it, made my stomach churn. No, I whispered, struggling to keep my voice steady. I didn't mean for it to happen. It was a mistake. But it wasn't just a kiss. There was more to it. The words spilled out before I could stop them, and the moment they left my lips, I regretted them. There was no going back now. The admission hung in the air between us like a confession of the worst kind, and I could see the way it shattered him, piece by piece. His face hardened, a flash of pain quickly masked by anger. "You've always had a way of justifying things, haven't you?" he said, his voice low but sharp as a blade. "Always telling yourself that it wasn't as bad as it seemed, that it wasn't really cheating. But it is. It always has been." I could feel the sting of those words, like each one was carving a deeper wound into the already fragile fabric of our relationship. My heart twisted in my chest, and I couldn't help the tears that welled up in my eyes. God, how had I become this person? "I never meant to hurt you," I whispered, my voice trembling with the weight of my own guilt. "I didn't think it would hurt this much. I didn't think it would go this far." His gaze softened for a brief moment, a flicker of something, sadness, maybe, passing through his eyes before it was quickly replaced by that familiar defensive wall, the one he'd built so carefully over the years to protect himself. From me, from the lies, from the hurt I had inflicted on him time and time again. "Why didn't you just come to me?" he asked, his voice almost pleading as if he couldn't comprehend why I hadn't turned to him when things started to slip. Why didn't you talk to me? Instead of this? His eyes flicked to the ground, as if the weight of what I had done was too much to even look at. And in that moment, I felt the distance between us stretch even further, an insurmountable gap that no words, no apologies could ever cross. He was right. I should have come to him. I should have been honest about what was going on inside my head, instead of letting everything fester until it boiled over. I should have seen the warning signs, should have realized how far I was slipping, but I didn't, and now I was paying the price for it. I didn't know how, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know how to tell you, how to fix what was broken between us. I thought maybe I could just escape for a little while. I thought it wouldn't matter. He shook his head, a pained smile tugging at the corner of his lips. But it wasn't a smile. It was a mask, a facade he wore to keep himself from falling apart. Escape? He repeated, his tone incredulous. You thought running away from me would solve everything? I could see the hurt in his eyes, and it made my chest tighten with regret. I had never wanted to hurt him, never wanted to betray him. But that's exactly what I'd done. And now, I was losing him. I was wrong, I said, my voice cracking as the tears finally spilled over. I've been wrong about so many things, about you, about us. I thought if I ignored it, if I pretended everything was fine, it would be. But it wasn't. And now, I don't know how to fix it. For a moment, there was silence. Again. A silence so heavy it felt like it was suffocating me. And then, finally, he spoke. I don't know if you can fix it, he said quietly, the vulnerability in his voice so raw that it made my heart ache. I don't know if you can fix what's been broken, what you've broken. The weight of his words hit me like a tidal wave, and I staggered back, overwhelmed by the enormity of what I had done. As the weight of those words settled between us, I couldn't help but feel like a stranger in my own life. The person I had once known, the man I thought I had a future with, now seemed like a distant memory, a fragile echo of what we had been. He stood there, his back straight and his arms crossed in front of him, a wall of defense against me, against everything I had done. The air between us crackled with tension, and in that silence I could almost hear the ticking of the clock. Each second more final than the last. I can't undo what I've done. I thought that maybe, just maybe, there could be some way back. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the damage was too deep, the hurt too raw. The man I had kissed, the one who had been my fleeting escape, was nothing compared to what I was about to lose. The thought of him now felt hollow, empty, like a page in a book I didn't want to read anymore. What do we do now? I whispered, my voice fragile, barely carrying the weight of the question. He met my gaze, his expression unreadable. And for a moment I saw the man I had once loved, the one who could have forgiven me, the one who could have seen past my mistakes. But there was something different in his eyes now, a hardness, a distance. He was no longer looking at me with the same tenderness, the same trust. I don't know, he said, his voice low and steady. I don't know if I can keep doing this, not after everything. The words struck me like a physical blow, and I staggered back, my hand flying to my mouth in disbelief. I had known that he was hurt. But hearing him say it, hearing him doubt the very foundation of everything we had built, it shattered me. I'm sorry, I whispered. But the apology felt so small, so insignificant against the enormity of what I had done. He shook his head, his eyes never leaving mine. Sorry doesn't fix it. You can't just say sorry and expect everything to go back to how it was. I knew that. But how could I live with myself knowing that I had been the one to ruin it? The one to break the trust that had once held us? together to betray him in the most intimate way imaginable. I didn't know if I could fix it. I didn't know if there was any way back from this, but I was willing to try. Because what I had with him, what we had, was worth fighting for, even if it seemed impossible now. "Is it over?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared at me, as though weighing the gravity of his decision. Then, slowly, he spoke. "I don't know. I don't know if I can forgive you. I don't know if I can forget. But that's something I'll have to figure out." My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a mixture of hope and dread swirling together like a storm. He hadn't said yes. He hadn't said it was over either. But the uncertainty between us was palpable. I took a step toward him, my hand trembling as I reached out. "Please, give me a chance to make it right." His gaze softened, but only slightly. He glanced down at my hand before meeting my eyes. Again. "I don't know if I can trust you anymore," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know if I can go back to what we were." I nodded, the weight of his words sinking in like stones in my chest. The pain of his doubt was worse than anything I had ever felt, because in that moment I realized just how much I had taken him for granted, how much I had taken us for granted. "I don't deserve your trust," I said quietly. "But I'll spend the rest of my life trying to earn it back." He didn't respond. The silence stretched between us, more suffocating than ever, as we both stood there, trying to make sense of what had been and what might still be. What could we be, I thought, as I took a step back. The road ahead was uncertain, the future hazy, with the fog of doubt. But there was one thing I was sure of. I was willing to face it, whatever it took, and maybe, just maybe, there was a chance, however small, that we could rebuild what I had destroyed. The days that followed were filled with tension, an unbearable quiet that settled over our once lively home. The laughter that used to echo in the kitchen, the gentle hum of our everyday moments, was now replaced with an awkward silence. Every word felt heavy, every glance loaded with meaning. We were two strangers, bound by shared history but unsure of where to go from here. I spent hours lost in my thoughts, replaying the night of the kiss in my mind. How had I allowed myself to stray so far from the person I once was? What did I really want? The kiss, the fleeting connection. It wasn't what I thought it would be. It was nothing more than a temporary escape, a misguided attempt to fill a void I didn't even know I had. But now, in the aftermath, all I could think about was him, the man I had hurt, the one who deserved my loyalty, my trust. I couldn't erase the image of his face when he had caught me in the lie, the look of betrayal in his eyes. It haunted me, like a shadow that refused to leave. I wasn't sure what I was trying to fix. Was it my actions? The damage I had done to him? Or was it the emptiness inside me that had led me to make such a reckless mistake? I had no answers. Only an overwhelming sense of guilt that gnawed at me from within. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the man I had once been was fading away. I had grown into someone I didn't recognize, someone who had hurt the person she loved the most. I hated her. I hated myself. But what could I do? Now? How could I fix it? He seemed distant. I could feel him slipping away, even though he was still physically there. His answers were brief, his gaze cold when he looked at me. He wasn't angry, at least not in the way I expected. It was something deeper. It was as if he had lost faith, not just in me, but in us. And I couldn't blame him. One evening, as the sun began to set and painted the sky with shades of orange and pink, I found myself standing at the kitchen counter, staring down at the cup of tea I had just made. The steam curled upward in delicate wisps, but it was the silence that surrounded me that truly felt suffocating. He hadn't said much that day. In fact, I couldn't even remember the last time we had really talked, really felt something together. I ran my fingers along the edge of the cup, feeling the warmth seep into my skin, but it did little to soothe the cold emptiness inside. I hadn't touched him in days. No small gestures, no whispered words, no shared glances. It was as if the space between us had grown into something vast, something insurmountable. The door opened behind me, and I didn't need to turn around to know it was him. I could feel his presence before I even saw him. He wasn't angry. He wasn't shouting. He was quiet, resigned. And in that moment, I realized that the worst part wasn't the affair itself. The worst part was the indifference, the quiet surrender to something broken. He stood there for a long while, his eyes on the floor, before his voice broke the silence. "You know," he began, his tone so calm, it was almost unnerving. I thought I knew you. I thought I knew everything about you, but now I don't know who you are anymore." I bit my lip, trying to hold back the flood of emotions that threatened to overtake me. How could I explain this? How could I explain that the person I had become was not the person I wanted to be? The person I had hurt was still the one I loved, the only one I had ever truly loved. But that didn't seem to matter to him now. "Why did you do it?" His voice cracked slightly as he asked the question that had been lingering between us for days. "Why did you kiss him? What was so wrong with us that you had to go looking for something else?" I couldn't answer him, not in a way that would make sense, not in a way that would explain the depths of my own confusion. I had hurt him, and no words could undo that. "I don't know," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "I don't know why I did it, but I know I don't want to lose you." He was silent for a long time. I could feel him grappling with the weight of my words, his internal struggle, just as real as mine. Then, finally, he spoke again, though his words were not a resolution. They were a question. "I don't know if I can forgive you. I don't know if I can forget this. But can you give me time?" His words didn't fill me with relief as I had hoped. No, they filled me with a new kind of terror, one that I had never felt before. The kind of terror that comes with knowing that something precious is slipping away and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Time. I didn't know if time would heal this, if it would give us a chance to rebuild. But I knew that it was the only chance we had left. I turned slowly, meeting his eyes for the first time in days. "I'll give you all the time you need," I said quietly, "and I'll wait. I'll wait for you to find it in your heart to forgive me." The days turned into weeks, and with every passing hour, the weight of uncertainty pressed heavier on both of us. The space that had been requested between us, once an opportunity for healing, was now a chasm that seemed to stretch endlessly. We had become two people living parallel lives under the same roof, a house bound by shared history, but with its foundation cracked, weakened, and brittle. I could feel him in the house, his presence like a constant hum in the background. I knew when he was near, even if our interactions were brief, when our paths crossed in the hallway, or when we sat in silence over dinner. But the conversations were empty now. Words, once so easy to exchange, now hung in the air like lead, impossible to lift. One evening, as the fading sun filtered through the curtains, I sat in the dim light of the living room, my fingers tracing the outline of a photograph on the coffee table. It was one of us from years ago, smiling, carefree, oblivious to the storm that would eventually come. I remembered the way we used to talk for hours, the way we would make each other laugh until our sides ached. What had happened to us? I hadn't made any move to reach out, and neither had he. It was as if we were both waiting for something, a spark, a shift in the air, some sign that we could be who we once were. But there were no sparks. There were no signs, only the silence, thick and heavy. I had begun to question everything. Had I ever really known him? Had he ever truly known me? How could we have drifted so far apart without either of us noticing? The guilt that gnawed at me earlier now turned into self-doubt. Maybe we were never meant to be together. Maybe this was the way it was always going to end. I looked up from the photograph when I heard the soft creak of the floorboards. He was standing at the edge of the living room, his body tense, eyes searching mine. There was no anger in his gaze anymore, but there was something deeper. Something I couldn't read, and it unsettled me. His lips parted, but for a long while no words came. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, measured. I think I've been holding on to something that isn't there anymore." His eyes softened, and his shoulders slumped as if the weight of his own words had crushed him. "I don't think I can keep pretending like everything is fine, like I can forgive you for what you did, when it feels like a part of me died that night." His words felt like an emotional blow, not because they were unexpected, but because they were raw and honest. I had broken him, and I hadn't realized just how deep that break ran. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to stay composed. "I know I've destroyed something between us. I know I've hurt you in a way that might be unforgivable, but I can't pretend like I don't want to try again. I can't stand the thought of us being strangers, in our own home." He took a step forward, but still, there was a distance between us, not just physical, but emotional. He was testing the waters, I could tell. His eyes never left mine, but the silence between us was profound. Was this the moment when everything would shift? Would it be a moment of healing? Or would it be the final goodbye? He took another step, and I felt my pulse quicken, the space between us narrowing with each footfall. I could feel my heart pounding, my breath shallow. Was he going to kiss me? Was he going to reach for me? Or would he keep holding back, as he had for so long? But then, just as quickly, his expression hardened and he stepped back, breaking the fragile tension that had built between us. "I don't know if I can be who I was for you again," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Because I don't even know who I am anymore." The words hit me like ice water. He was right. Who were we now? We weren't the people we had been before. Our love, once so simple, had become complex, frayed at the edges and tangled in ways I wasn't sure I could ever untangle. "I've been thinking about what you said," he continued, his voice steadying. "You said you wanted to try again, but what does that even look like? Can we go back to what we had? Can we build something from the wreckage of what's left?" I opened my mouth to answer, but nothing came out. What could I say? I had no clear answer. I didn't know if we could go back to who we were, but I was terrified of moving forward without him. The thought of never seeing the warmth in his eyes, again of never feeling his touch, was unbearable. "You asked for time," he said, his eyes shifting downward as if the weight of everything was too much for him to carry. "But time doesn't heal all wounds. Some things are beyond repair." I swallowed hard, the lump in my throat making it difficult to speak. "I don't want to lose you," I said, the desperation leaking into my voice despite my best efforts to stay composed. "I don't want us to be just memories." The days stretched on like an endless river, each moment teeming with the undercurrent of possibility, fear, and the quiet desperation to rebuild something that had once been whole. We had decided to move forward together. At least that was what we told ourselves. But the path wasn't a simple one. In fact, it felt more like an intricate maze, and we were both fumbling in the dark, trying to navigate it without the map we once had. I spent a lot of time reflecting in those early days. The silence between us was filled with unspoken words, and I could feel the walls we had erected around ourselves, around our hearts. We weren't the same people who had once shared everything. There was a distance now, a gap between us that seemed to widen with every quiet glance, every tentative touch. But we were both trying. It was an effort, but not one of us was ready to give up. There were small moments where it felt like we were on the verge of something. When our fingers brushed over coffee cups, or when we shared a brief, fleeting laugh over something silly. But those moments were fragile, and sometimes I wondered if we were only clinging to the past because we didn't know what else to hold on to. I could feel the strain in his eyes as he moved through the house. He was quieter now, less present in the spaces we had once shared so comfortably. I understood the hesitation, though. The trust between us had been shattered, and neither of us could pretend it was as easy as patching it back together. It would take time. But time had its own way of changing things. The evenings were the hardest, in the quiet of the night. After everything had settled into stillness, I could feel the weight of the day pressing against us. We lay side by side, but the distance between us in the darkness felt unbearable. There were moments when I reached for him, just to remind myself that he was still here, still within reach. But I knew he could feel it too. The uncertainty, the unanswered questions that lingered like ghosts in the room. One night as we lay there, the tension in the air was palpable. The gentle hum of the world outside seemed distant, and all I could hear was the steady rhythm of our breathing. I turned to him, my eyes tracing the outline of his face in the dim light. His features were soft, but there was a sadness behind his eyes that I couldn't ignore. I knew he was still carrying the weight of it all, the betrayal, the disappointment, the feeling that everything had been cracked beyond repair. But I couldn't fix it. I couldn't undo the things I had done. I could only show him, in whatever small ways I could, that I was willing to fight for us, for what we could still become, and maybe that would be enough. Or maybe it wouldn't. "I'm sorry," I whispered, my voice barely audible in the stillness. He didn't respond immediately, but after a moment, I felt his hand shift under the covers, and then, to my surprise, it found mine. He didn't speak, but his fingers curled around mine, warm and hesitant, as if he were trying to figure out whether or not he could still trust me. There was a vulnerability in that touch, a hesitance that spoke louder than any words. "I don't know if we'll ever be what we were," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. "But maybe we can be something else, something different. We're not the same people we were before. We've changed. But maybe we can still make something out of that." I held on to his hand tighter, not sure if I was holding on to him or to the hope that had been slowly taking root in my chest. Maybe it wasn't about going back to what we had, but about forging a new connection, a new foundation to stand on, together, this time. The road was long, and it wasn't going to be easy. We both knew that, but I also knew something else. This wasn't the end. It was only a new beginning, and sometimes that was all you could ask for.